I'm coming on board to try and make sure that those loopholes that pedophiles have been exploiting for over 20 years is closed and that Australia becomes the most dangerous place on the earth to become a child sex offender.
I think one thing that a lot of Australians would find surprising is that we don't have a public accessible sex offender registry.
There should be no rhyme or reason why offenders shouldn't be forced to enable survivors of sexual-related crimes to access a superannuation to get redress for the horrific crimes that they sustain.
Now we're going to be speaking to Andrew Carpenter. Andrew's a solicitor from South Australia and he's been heavily involved in campaigning for the rights of victims of child sexual abuse. Andrew.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the time.
One of the things we wanted to speak to you about, Andrew, that I find particularly interesting is the roadblock that you've encountered trying to seek compensation for victims of child abuse.
Sure. The one thing I find with a lot of survivors is it's a life sentence they've been handed. It's their innocence have been effectively taken away from them because of the selfish actions of an offender. What I'm finding over the past 12 years of doing survivor work is a lot of people are not actually getting the justice they deserve. The percentage rate of convictions in historic sexual abuse claims is less than 2%, because the national average for someone to report this is 33 years. So a lot of people are finding that if they are lucky enough to get a conviction, there could be hundreds of charges against them and someone just makes a plea for, indecent assault or something like that. Now, that doesn't give the survivor justice. If they then try to sue the offender, most of the time the offender is able to sell their house to dispose assets, to pay large lump sums into their lawyer's trust account to appeal. They continue to appeal to try and dilute all their funds that way, and often leaving their survivors with next to nothing. Now, the indemnification of these crimes then falls onto the taxpayer, whether it be by a victims of crime payment or social security or ongoing medical treatment.
Absolutely,
So
and that's a consideration.
It is. So these survivors effectively, they go through the ringer of a criminal trial and they walk away with nothing. Now, if someone doesn't have any assets in their name, if they've worked since 1985, they would have a large amount of superannuation in their account. So there should be no rhyme or reason why offenders shouldn't be forced to enable survivors of sexual-related crimes to access a superannuation to get redress for the horrific crimes that they sustain. Now, there's been total systemic failures about survivors being compensated over the years. There's been broken promises by the government, and there's been roadblocks in front of them to try and get the justice they deserve. I'm coming on board to try and make sure that those loopholes that pedophiles have been exploiting for over 20 years is closed and that Australia becomes the most dangerous place on the earth to become a child sex offender, because not only do you stand at risk of losing your liberty, you should stand at risk of losing everything you've ever worked for. So in 2020, I basically started contacting ministers, government departments, and simply saying, hey, why isn't this changing? And every minister that I spoke to had no idea that it was tabled in Parliament. Now, there was a consultation paper made in 2018 where all the major superannuation companies supported it, women's charities supported it, children's charities supported it, and nothing happened since then. And I kept on having meeting after meeting, and the response that I got every single time was, oh, well, superannuation laws are very hard to change and confiscation of assets are very hard to do. I said, well, that's funny. When COVID hit, it was 10 days before the Parliament passed legislation to enable people to access superannuation for hardship.
There needs to be a will. There needs to be a will. There needs to be a will to make the change.
Yep.
People listening to this podcast, what could they do to support what you're trying to push through? How could they support you?
There's a change.org petition at the moment that's up to 45,000 people supporting this change. Now, when the Liberals promised to change it in 2017, the petition had 20,000 people. We're well over double that now. And so it's just really hammering your local MPs to find out why. And every minister I've spoken to, I've said, this is the definition of a no-brainer change. Yep. It's going to save the taxpayers money. It's going to compensate survivors. It's going to act as a deterrent. Why aren't political parties jumping up and down and saying, hey, let's support this? The only reason why I got any traction was back in 2021, I came across Adam Washbourne, who you interviewed for this story as well, from a great charity called Fighters Against Childhood Abuse Australia. He started campaigning with me. The Carly Ryan Foundation got involved, and then the Grace Tame Foundation got involved. Now, it was only when the Grace Tame Foundation got involved where ministers would actually want to talk to us because they were scared of a 5'3" Tasmanian. Which and she has the loudest voice in Australia about child advocacy, but it shouldn't be taking people whose job it's not, so myself and other people, to get the government to do their own job in something that they promised to do 5 years ago.
I think one thing that a lot of Australians would find surprising is that we don't have a public accessible sex offender registry. There are a few rogue operators out there who seek to name and shame. Certain bodies like the West Australian Police can confirm suspicions. There are some legal firms who identify as sex offence litigators, but we don't have a sex offender registry. Why don't we have one? Why do we need one?
Well, the reason why we don't have one is because the Liberals promised, I think in 2018, that they would set it up. There was millions of dollars set aside to do that, and there's no one knows the reason why it hasn't been done. Now, the importance of having a registry is that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys experience some form of sexual abuse in their lifetime.
And the stats are
Now,
much
this
higher
is
than
not
that
some,
in reality. That's
it is. This is
reported
not something
offences.
that's yeah, it's not something that's so far removed from people that not no one knows anyone that's had this to them. 25% of girls have this to them when they're young.
And
That's
I
the
need to
reason why
clarify,
this
that's
registry is.
reported cases. How many people are not reporting it? So the stats are higher than that.
Yeah, and what I'm seeing often when I represent people is that a person that does it, they don't get caught. They do it again and again and again. It's a very rare thing where someone's one and done. When you never see someone getting arrested with, 5 child exploitation images in one video, you're seeing people getting arrested with hundreds of thousands of photos and, terabytes upon terabytes of videos. It's something, like I said before, it's an endemic at the moment. It's continuing to happen, and there needs to be greater protection for children around Australia. Now, simply getting a register set up like that is to make sure that people aren't living close to schools, because most of the offenders that are arrested and charged with this, their identity is suppressed. You will never know who they are. They won't report on them. And so no one's safe without knowing who's around them.
We've heard very heavily about the impact that sexual abuse has on people, not just at the time, but throughout their lives. Do you think the courts recognise the impact on victims, and do you think the punishment fits the crime? From a legal perspective, you would have spent a lot of time in courts.
No, I don't think it's adequate at the moment. Survivors are often dealt life sentences. So many survivors that I've represented, they'll never complete school, they'll never work, they'll never get married, they'll never have kids, they'll never have superannuation. They're in and out of doctors. They give up medication to afford food most weeks. Where the very rare convictions that you see people get is there could be hundreds and hundreds of charges and they might be found guilty of one because the survivors really don't remember what happened 34 years ago. And when you're seeing people getting suspended sentences or released on good behaviour in 6 months when they've engaged in horrendous crimes against children, it's not enough. I mean, the reason why that I've pushed for this super change to be relating to survivors of sexual abuse only is crimes against children are the only crimes that there is absolutely no legal justification for. If you look at murder, you can have a legal justification: self-defense, self-defense of another, excessive force. Drink driving, I had to drive my friend to hospital, or I had to, drive my dog to the vet. But there is not one defense you can make for sexually abusing a child. You can't say they consented because they can't. You can't say, the usual thing of a lot of rapists. They say, oh, but she was wearing provocative clothes and came over to my house. You can't say that for a child.
Yeah.
And so when you're doing a crime against a child where you're taking advantage of someone that cannot consent to the act against them, that is the worst kind of offending. And if you're out in 6 months because of something like that, that doesn't meet the crime. It should be minimum mandatory sentences across the board for all crimes like this, because again, you're giving a child a life sentence when this happens.